The wind is screaming against the cabin walls right now, and there's a woman on the bed behind me, soaked through with sweat, gripping the edge of the mattress so hard her knuckles have gone white as bone. I've got my hands still wet from the basin, and I'm about to tell you something that's going to sound like the opposite of everything you've ever been told about frontier childbirth. The doctor riding 2 counties over, the one everybody in this valley trusts more than they trust their own mothers and grandmothers, the one with the black bag and the fine coat and the medical school certificate hanging on his office wall back in town. That man killed more frontier mothers than any blizzard, any wolf, any flooded river crossing ever did. I know how that sounds. So stay with me, because once you understand why, you'll never look at a birthing room the same way again. Let me tell you who I am first, so you understand I'm not guessing at any of this. I've caught babies in cabins with the wind tearing at the roof shakes and no other soul for 11 miles. I've sat with women through nights so long. The candle burned down twice before dawn ever showed its face. I've held newborns still slick and squalling while their mothers wept with relief. And I've held the hands of those same mothers 4 days later while the fever took them instead, right there in the same bed where the joy had happened barely a week before. And I've buried more young mothers than I care to count, not from anything wild or savage or unavoidable, but from something so simple, so completely preventable, that it makes my chest go tight even now, decades later, just talking about it. The thing that killed them wasn't the cold. It wasn't blood loss, not usually, though that took its share too, same as it always has. It wasn't a baby turned wrong in the womb. The thing that stole the most frontier mothers, the thing that left whole homesteads quiet and husbands standing useless in doorways, was a fever. A fever that came on 2, 3, 4 days after the birth, when everybody had already breathed their sigh of relief, when the baby was already swaddled and nursing and the worst was supposedly behind them. The mother would seem fine at first. Tired, sore, but fine, same as any woman is after bringing a child into the world. And then the fever would come in like a tide nobody saw rising. Her belly would grow tender to the touch, swollen in a way it hadn't been the day before. Her breath would come shallow and fast, like she'd been running though she hadn't left the bed. Her mind would start to wander, saying things that made no sense, calling out names of people who weren't in the room, and within a week, sometimes less, she'd be gone, leaving an infant behind that would never once hear her voice or know the shape of her face. They called it childbed fever back then, and out here on the frontier, folks whispered about it the way they whispered about consumption or the pox, like it was some curse sent down on women specifically, some cruel toll built into the very act of bringing new life into the world. Some believed it was bad air rising off the swamps in summer. Some believed it was a woman's own constitution failing her at the worst possible moment. Some believed a hard birth simply led to a harder death, plain as that. And there wasn't a single thing to be done about it, because that's how it had always been, going back as far as anyone's grandmother could remember. Here's the part that's going to sit heavy with you, so hold on to it, because it's the whole spine of this story. The homes where a fever came on hardest and fastest and killed the most mothers weren't the poor, isolated cabins with no doctor for 100 miles in any direction. They were, more often than anyone wanted to admit, the homes where a proper physician had ridden out and personally attended the birth. The very presence of the man everyone trusted most, the man everyone had begged and paid and waited on, was frequently the single greatest danger sitting in that room. I'm going to show you exactly how that's possible, but not yet. Keep it in the back of your mind, because it matters more than anything else I'm about to tell you, and once you see the whole shape of it, you won't be able to unsee it. Before any of that makes sense, you have to understand how a frontier physician actually spent his week, because that's where the whole terrible truth is hiding, buried in plain sight the entire time. A doctor riding a circuit back in those days wasn't just delivering babies, not by a long stretch. He was doing everything a community needed of him, all at once, with the same 2 hands and the same battered leather bag. He was setting broken bones after a wagon wreck. He was lancing infected wounds that had gone green and foul. He was, more often than folks like to remember when they picture frontier medicine as something clean and noble, performing autopsies on the dead, cutting into bodies that had died of fevers and infections and rot, learning the deeper mysteries of his own trade with his bare hands buried in tissue that was already breaking down. And then, hours later, sometimes the very same day, that same man would climb back onto his horse, ride out to some homestead a day's journey off, walk into a cabin where a woman was laboring hard, wash his hands maybe if the basin happened to be handy and he happened to think of it, and reach inside her body to check how far along she'd come. Nobody thought a thing of it. Why would they? There was no understanding back then, not out here, not really anywhere in the civilized world yet, of what was actually traveling on those hands from one place to the next. The doctor himself had no idea, and it would be unfair to call him careless in any way he could have recognized. He believed, same as everybody else believed, that disease drifted through bad air, through foul odors rising off standing water and rotting matter, through some vague miasma that hung low over swamps and sick rooms like a fog you could nearly see. The notion that something invisible, something too small for any eye to catch, could ride along quietly on his own skin and travel from a corpse on a table to a laboring mother in her own bed would have sounded like witchcraft to him, or worse, an insult to his own sense of himself as a clean and careful professional. He'd have laughed you clean out of the room for suggesting it, so he'd wash his hands, if he washed them at all, in the very same basin the family used for their supper dishes, dry them on the same cloth hanging by the hearth that the children used, and go about the most important work of his entire profession carrying, without the faintest idea in the world, the very thing that would kill the woman lying in front of him within the week. Here's where most folks go wrong, even today, looking back on this whole tragedy with the comfort of distance. Lean in close, because if this next part doesn't land properly, nothing else I tell you afterward will make sense of the scale of what was lost. Down deep, people carry the belief that a fever after childbirth was just nature's way of things, some unavoidable toll the body paid for the sheer effort of the miracle it had just performed, the same way frost was a toll that winter demanded of the land. It's about the most natural assumption in the world to make, and I don't fault anyone living back then for believing it. A woman's body had just been through something enormous, something violent in its own honest right, and surely a fever afterward was simply part of that ordeal, wasn't it? A price paid, same as always. It was not, and that single wrong belief, held by educated men and simple farmers alike, cost more lives than almost any other misunderstanding in the whole history of frontier medicine. Childbed fever wasn't nature's toll at all. It was contamination, plain and simple, though not a soul out here had the word for it yet, nor the science to prove it. It was an infection carried in on unwashed hands, passed from one laboring woman to the next, from a corpse in a back examination room, straight to a living mother in her own bed, a county away. And the mothers who suffered least from this particular horror, the ones who most often walked away whole and strong and able to raise the child they'd just born, were very often the ones attended only by local midwives, women who had never once touched a cadaver in their entire lives, women whose only formal training was decades spent, watching their own mothers and aunts and grandmothers do this same sacred work. Sit with that part a moment, because it tells you something true that took the wider medical world generations to admit out loud and cost it dearly in pride to finally accept. The midwives, the very women so often dismissed by educated society as untrained, unscientific, beneath the dignity of a real physician's attention, were frequently the safer hands in that room. Not because they understood germs any better than the doctor did. They didn't. Not one bit more than he. But because their daily work never carried them from the dead to the living the way his profession demanded of him. Their hands, whether they knew the reason or not, simply weren't loaded with the same invisible danger he unknowingly carried from house to house. The mothers who suffered worst of all weren't even out here on the frontier. They were back east, in the growing city hospitals, where this same tragedy played out on a scale that would make your blood run cold if you sat with the numbers long enough. Wards where physicians and their eager young students moved directly from dissecting rooms full of the dead to delivery beds full of the laboring living, ward after ward, patient after patient, day after day, and childbed fever tore through those rooms like a plague with a genuine appetite, sometimes killing 1 in every 4 or 5 mothers who came through the hospital doors, seeking the very best care available anywhere in the country. Meanwhile, women who gave birth out in the street with no attendant at all, dirty hands or no hands touching them whatsoever, often fared better than the ones lying inside those fine brick hospitals, with all their supposed expertise and their gleaming instruments. That's the trap, laid out plain as I can make it. The very act of seeking out the most educated, most respected, most expensive help available was frequently the thing that sealed a young mother's fate, while the women who couldn't afford or access that same help sometimes lived simply and only because nobody carrying contamination on their hands ever came anywhere near them. Now circle back to what I told you to hold on to earlier. That riddle of how the poorest homes, the ones furthest from any trained doctor's reach, were so often the safest. Because here's the whole answer laid bare, and once you see it, every other piece of this story locks neatly into place around it. There was a physician, a real one, working in a hospital in Vienna in the years before the frontier states out here had even finished filling in their maps, a man named Ignaz Semmelweis. And he noticed the very thing I've just described to you, laid out right in front of him in his own hospital's records. In his ward, one run by physicians and eager medical students, men who came straight from the autopsy room to the delivery room without pause, mothers died of childbed fever at a staggering, sickening rate. In another ward in that very same building, run entirely by midwives who never once touched a corpse in the course of their duties, far fewer mothers died. He couldn't explain why, not in the precise language of germs, because that language simply didn't exist yet, not fully, not in any form the world had agreed upon. But he had a hunch, a strange and almost desperate one, born more of grief than of any grand theory. He ordered the physicians and students under his authority to wash their hands thoroughly in a chlorinated lime solution, before ever laying a finger on a laboring woman, not out of some elegant scientific insight, but almost out of sheer desperation, grasping at anything at all that might stop the relentless dying he watched happen week after week. And the deaths in his ward fell almost overnight, fell so sharply, so undeniably, that the numbers themselves told a story no honest man could argue against, if he was willing to look at them plainly. Here's the part that ought to make you sit up straight in your chair, the part that proves this isn't some campfire tale I'm spinning for you across the miles. Semmelweis published his findings for the whole medical world to see. He showed the numbers plainly, mothers saved by nothing grander than the simple washing of hands before an examination. And the medical establishment of his own time, the very men his simple discovery accused, without ever meaning to, refused outright to believe him. They mocked him in print and in person. They dismissed the very idea that a gentleman physician's hands could possibly carry filth capable of killing a healthy young mother. The notion insulted their whole sense of themselves as men of science, refinement, and cleanliness. He died in an asylum, broken in mind and utterly disregarded by his profession, years before the rest of the medical world finally caught up to what he had seen so clearly in his own hospital wards, written plainly in his own tallied numbers. That's not a cover-up in the way folks like to imagine cover-ups, some scheme cooked up behind closed doors by wicked men. It's something quieter than that, and in its own way, far sadder to sit with. It's pride. It's an entire class of educated, well-meaning men so certain of their own cleanliness, so utterly certain that dirt and disease belonged only to the poor and the uneducated and never to themselves, that they simply couldn't stomach the notion that their own hands were the very danger they'd sworn an oath to guard against. And that certainty, that flat refusal to be humbled by a simple, provable truth, cost mothers their lives for another full generation, before the lesson finally, truly took hold. Out here on the frontier, word of germs and proper washing traveled slower still, arriving years and sometimes decades behind the cities. By the time it finally reached the homesteads and the little prairie towns scattered across these plains, plenty of mothers had already gone into the ground over something that could have been stopped entirely, with nothing more than a basin of clean water and a bar of soap, used before the examination instead of only after, or not at all. Let me be straight with you now, the way I'd want somebody straight with me if our positions were reversed. I won't dress this up bigger than it truly was, and I won't sit here and tell you that every frontier mother who called for a doctor ended up dead of this. Most didn't, thank God. Most births, then as now, when on the way births mostly go, with pain and effort and exhaustion and a healthy child at the end of it, and a mother tired but whole, ready to raise the life she'd just brought into the world. But when the fever did come, when it did take hold in a household, it took hold hardest and cruelest in exactly the places everyone had assumed were safest. And that's the sorrow buried at the very center of this whole story. Mothers weren't dying because the frontier itself was cruel. The frontier was only ever the frontier, indifferent as stone, no crueler than it had always been. They were dying because everyone standing in that room, doctor and family alike, was certain that a trained physician's hands were cleaner than a midwife's rough working ones, certain that fever after birth was simply nature's due, unavoidable as the changing seasons, certain they already understood the one single thing they didn't understand at all. Here's how the women who lived through this era and came out the other side actually carried themselves. Not out of panic or superstition, but as a plain, practical way of doing things, once word did finally start reaching the homesteads scattered across this land. Wash the hands thoroughly before touching a laboring woman, every single time, without exception, whether those hands looked clean to the eye or not, because dirt you couldn't see with your own 2 eyes was still dirt, and it could still kill. Boil the cloths and every instrument thoroughly before they ever came anywhere near a birthing bed, no matter how much trouble that felt like on a cold night with water already scarce. Keep any physician who'd just come from tending the sick, the wounded, or the dead well away from a new mother until he'd properly and thoroughly scrubbed, no matter how educated, respected, or well-meaning that particular man happened to be. Trust the woman who'd caught 40 babies with her own 2 capable hands and never once touched a corpse over the man with the fine medical diploma who'd done exactly the opposite that same morning. And watch a new mother closely and carefully in those first days after birth, never once relaxing, simply because the baby had arrived safely and everyone's fear had already loosened, because the real and quiet danger for so many women was only just beginning to creep in unseen, exactly when the whole household had let its guard down. None of it cost anything more than a basin of clean water and a bit of hard-won humility. And that's the part that still catches in my throat all these years later, sitting here telling you this by firelight. The very thing that could have saved so very many of those young mothers wasn't some rare and costly medicine, wasn't some difficult surgery only available in a distant city. It was soap, plain and cheap as dirt itself, and a willingness on the part of educated men to admit that even a trained, respected, well-dressed physician could be carrying death on his own 2 hands without ever knowing it, without ever intending a single moment of harm. Maybe that's the real lesson buried underneath all of this, bigger than fevers and bigger than any one frontier winter or any one hard birth. Those mothers didn't die because childbirth itself was some cruel trap nature had specially set for women alone to suffer. Birth was only ever birth, hard and dangerous in its own honest ancient way, same as it had always been since the first mother ever labored beneath the first sky. They died because everyone standing in that room, however well-meaning, however educated, was certain. Certain that education meant cleanliness. Certain that authority and a fine coat meant safety. Certain they already knew the one single thing they hadn't yet properly learned, and wouldn't learn for another generation of grieving households. The frontier never punished a humble woman half so hard as it punished a certain man, and the women who survived this era, the ones who lived long enough to raise their children, and hold their own grandchildren in turn, feared their own certainty far more than they ever feared the fever itself, or the winter, or the wilderness pressing in against their cabin walls. That's the whole of it, small enough to carry in your 2 hands and cheap enough that any household, rich or poor, could manage it without a second thought. Wash before you touch, every single time. Boil what needs boiling, and don't skip it for the sake of convenience. Trust the hands that have only ever touched the living. Watch a new mother closely long after everyone else in the household has already stopped worrying and gone back to their chores. Do that much, faithfully and without fail, and a birthing room could survive nearly anything the frontier chose to throw against it. The women who settled this land with nothing but their own 2 hands and each other for company knew things were only now starting to properly remember and honor, written down in medical journals and taught in nursing schools, generations after it could have saved the very mothers who came before them and never got the chance to grow old. So tell me down in the comments, is there a piece of old wisdom passed down through the women in your own family? Something your grandmother or your great-grandmother knew and lived by without question, that's since been forgotten entirely or dismissed by the modern world as nothing more than old-fashioned superstition? I want to hear every last one of them. Next time, I'm going to hand you another one of these that turns everything you thought you knew clean on its head. An old belief about keeping a newborn warm through those first brutal frontier winters that ran completely backward from what actually saved a baby's life. And I'll show you exactly why the very instinct nearly every new mother trusted without question was, in the end, the thing working hardest against her. Until then, wash your hands before you ever judge whose hands are the dirty ones, and never let a fine coat or a framed diploma fool you into trusting certainty over a simple basin of clean water.